In the year 3152, Earth had become a distant memory. A legend told in hushed whispers among the surviving humans scattered across the galaxy. Humanity had faced extinction at the hands of the Krog, a powerful alien empire known for their brutal conquests. The Krag ruled through fear and spectacle, hosting grand arena battles where human slaves were forced to fight for the amusement of their alien overlords. Among these slaves was a frail-looking 9-year-old girl named Aria. Aria, with her wild, raven-black hair and piercing blue eyes, was far smaller than the other fighters. Her body bore the scars of past battles, but her spirit remained unbroken. She had survived the arena longer than anyone expected, outsmarting her opponents through quick thinking and sheer willpower. The Krog saw her as a curiosity, a weak creature defying the odds, and they mocked her every time she was forced into the blood-stained sands of the Colosseum. "Look at this one," snarled one of the Krog guards, his reptilian scales glistening under the harsh lights. "Barely worth the trouble. She'll be crushed in no time." The other guards laughed, their guttural voices filling the chamber where Aria sat in her small cage, awaiting her next battle. She said nothing, her eyes focused on the ground, but her mind raced. She had heard the stories, the legends of a weapon so powerful it could end the Krog's reign. A sword, hidden long ago by a philosopher who foresaw the rise of the Krog and sought to give humanity one last hope. They called it the Sword of the Philosopher, and Aria knew, deep in her heart, that finding it was her only chance. As the gates to the arena opened with a deafening roar, Aria stepped forward. The crowd, a mix of Krog warriors and other alien spectators, jeered and mocked her small form. Her opponent was a massive Krog champion, towering over her with a warhammer as large as her entire body. His scales shimmered in the sunlight, and his eyes gleamed with cruel amusement. "This will be quick," he growled, lifting his weapon high. "I'll give you one chance, little one. Beg for mercy." Aria gripped the rusty dagger she had been given, her only weapon. It was dull and barely functional, but it wasn't the weapon she relied on. It was her mind, her quick reflexes, and the belief that she was meant for more than just survival. She was meant to find the sword and end this nightmare. The signal to begin was given, and the Krog warrior charged. Aria darted to the side, narrowly avoiding the hammer's crushing blow. The ground shook as the weapon slammed into the arena floor, sending dust and debris flying. The crowd roared with laughter, entertained by the spectacle. But Aria was not here to entertain them. She was here to win. She moved with a speed that belied her small frame, circling her opponent, searching for a weakness. The Krog warrior swung again, and again she dodged, the hammer missing by mere inches. She knew she couldn't take him head-on. He was too strong, too well-armed. But she didn't need to. She just needed to outlast him. Minutes passed, and the Krog's frustration grew. His attacks became wilder, less controlled, and Aria seized her opportunity. As he lifted his hammer for another strike, she darted in close, slashing at the exposed joint in his armor. Her blade barely scratched the surface, but it was enough to make him stumble. The crowd's jeers turned to murmurs of surprise. This was not how the battle was supposed to go. Aria pressed her advantage, darting around the warrior and striking again. He roared in anger, swinging his hammer in a wide arc. Aria ducked under the blow, rolling across the ground and coming up behind him. With a cry of determination, she drove her dagger into the back of his knee, hitting a vulnerable spot. The Krog fell to one knee, his massive form shaking the ground as he collapsed. Aria leaped onto his back, clinging to his armor as she struggled to find a way to bring him down. With a final surge of strength, she drove her blade into the base of his skull, piercing the weak spot. The warrior let out a gurgled roar before falling silent, his body slumping to the ground with a resounding thud. For a moment, the arena was silent. Then, the crowd erupted into cheers and applause, though not for Aria. They cheered for the spectacle, for the entertainment. But Aria didn't care. She had survived again, and that was what mattered. As she was led back to her cage, battered and exhausted, her thoughts turned to the sword of the philosopher. She had heard the rumors from other slaves. Whispers of a hidden temple where the sword was kept, deep within the ancient ruins of Earth. It was said that only one who was pure of heart could wield it, and that it held the power to turn the tide of any war. Arya didn't know if the stories were true, but she had to believe they were. She had to believe that somewhere, hidden beneath the ashes of her homeworld, there was a way to end the Krog's reign. And she was going to find it. Arya sat in the cold, dark cell, her small body aching from the battle. The cheers of the crowd still echoed in her ears, but they were nothing more than noise to her now. She had survived, again. But survival wasn't enough. Not anymore. The whispers of the sword of the philosopher filled her mind as she sat, her fingers tracing the faded scars on her arms. She could picture it, gleaming under the rubble of Earth, waiting for someone, waiting for her, to claim it. But first, she had to escape this place. As the heavy metal door to her cell creaked open, a Krog guard stepped inside, grinning at her with his jagged teeth. "You're lucky, human. They like watching you. You'll fight again soon." Arya said nothing, her blue eyes narrowing. She knew how the Krog thought. They saw her as a weakling, something to be toyed with until she finally broke. But they were wrong. She hadn't survived this long just to die in their games. Once the guard left, Arya turned her attention to the small vent in the corner of her cell. She had noticed it days ago, but hadn't dared approach it while under surveillance. Now, though, the cameras were off, and she had a brief moment alone. The vent was tiny, barely big enough for someone her size. She bit her lip, thinking it through. If the stories were true and the sword was on Earth, she had to get off this planet. The arena was located in the heart of the Krog capital, a fortress world surrounded by fleets of warships. But she knew there were supply ships, smaller, less guarded, that came and went from the lower levels of the arena complex. If she could reach one of those, she might have a chance. Arya moved quickly, grabbing a rusted piece of metal she had hidden under her makeshift bed. She had scavenged it from the arena after her first fight, knowing it might come in handy. She wedged the metal into the edges of the vent and began to pry it open, her heart racing. Time was not on her side. If she was caught, the punishment would be brutal. After several tense minutes, the vent cover came loose with a soft clatter. Arya glanced over her shoulder, listening for any sign of the guards. Nothing. She took a deep breath and crawled into the narrow shaft, pulling the cover back into place behind her. The air in the vents was stale, and the darkness pressed in around her. She crawled on her hands and knees, every movement slow and deliberate to avoid making noise. She could hear the faint hum of machinery around her and the occasional distant voice of a guard. But for now, she was safe. After what felt like an eternity, the shaft opened up into a larger chamber. Arya peeked through a grate and saw what she had been hoping for, a docking bay. Several small ships were parked inside, their crews loading crates of supplies onto them. The ships were sleek, designed for quick transport rather than combat, and they didn't appear to have heavy guard detail. Arya's heart leaped with hope, but she knew she wasn't out of danger yet. She needed a plan. Just running for the ships would get her caught instantly. She scanned the room, looking for anything she could use. Then she spotted it, a group of human slaves, much like herself, moving crates under the watchful eyes of a few Krog overseers. The slaves wore simple uniforms, meant to distinguish them as non-combatants, unarmed, and unimportant. Arya's mind raced. If she could blend in with them, she might be able to slip aboard one of the ships unnoticed. Arya waited, watching the overseers' patterns. They were lazy, their attention divided between the slaves and their conversations with each other. When the moment was right, she pushed the grate open as quietly as she could and dropped down into the shadows of the bay. Moving quickly, she grabbed a discarded uniform from a pile of supplies and pulled it over her tattered clothes. Her heart pounded in her chest as she walked toward the slaves, trying to look as if she belonged there. None of them spared her a glance. They were too beaten down to notice much of anything. The overseers, too, seemed uninterested in one more human in the mix. Arya began to help load the crates, her eyes constantly darting toward the ships. She needed to time this perfectly. As the last crate was loaded onto one of the transport ships, the overseers barked orders for the slaves to return to their quarters. Arya didn't move. Instead, she slipped into the shadows behind the crate, hiding until the overseers turned their backs. The transport's hatch began to close, and Arya knew this was her only chance. With a silent prayer, she darted forward, slipping through the closing door just in time. She found herself in a small cargo hold, cramped and dimly lit, but it didn't matter. She was inside. The ship's engines hummed to life, and Arya felt the floor beneath her tremble as the transport lifted off. She crouched behind the crates, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She had done it. She was leaving the arena, leaving the Krog capital. But her journey was far from over. She still had to find the sword. And once she did, she would return, not just to survive, but to fight back. As the transport soared into the blackness of space, Arya allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. Arya crouched low in the shadow of a crumbling skyscraper, the wind howling through the desolate ruins of what had once been a thriving human city. The sky above was a murky gray, and the air was thick with dust and ash. Earth was no longer the blue-green jewel it had once been. After the Krag invasion, it had become little more than a wasteland, abandoned and forgotten by both humans and aliens alike. The transport ship had dropped her off on the outskirts of a long-dead city. Arya wasn't sure if it was New York, Tokyo, or somewhere else entirely. All human cities looked the same now, destroyed and covered in debris. But none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was the sword of the Philosopher, and according to the legends, it was hidden somewhere beneath the rubble. She clutched a small device in her hand, a scanner she had taken from the ship's supplies. It wasn't much, but it could pick up energy signatures, and the sword, if it existed, would give off a unique one. Her only hope was that the stories weren't just myths. As she moved silently through the ruins, her mind kept going back to the tales she had overheard during her time in the arena. The Krag had laughed at the idea of a weapon so powerful that it could shift the balance of power in the galaxy. But Arya had seen enough to know that sometimes legends were true, and this one could be the key to humanity's survival. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional creaking of a collapsed building or the distant cry of some wild creature. Arya's senses were on high alert. She knew the Krog still sent patrols to Earth from time to time, searching for any hidden human resistance or valuable artifacts. If they caught her, she'd never stand a chance. After several hours of navigating the maze of rubble and broken roads, her scanner beeped softly. Arya froze, her heart racing. She glanced down at the screen. A faint energy reading flickered across the display, coming from deep underground. This was it. The signal was coming from beneath what used to be a grand library, now nothing more than a skeleton of its former self. Arya climbed over the fallen beams and shattered glass, her eyes scanning for an entrance to the lower levels. Finally, she found a narrow stairwell, half buried under debris, leading down into the darkness. With a deep breath, she descended into the cold, damp underworld. The smell of mold and decay filled her nose, and the only light came from the faint glow of her scanner. The signal grew stronger with every step she took, pulling her deeper into the forgotten catacombs beneath the city. After what felt like an eternity, she reached a massive rusted door. The scanner was now beeping rapidly. The sword was on the other side. Arya's pulse quickened. She pressed her ear to the door, but heard nothing. Gathering her courage, she pushed the door open with a groan of protesting metal. Inside was a vast chamber, filled with ancient machinery and strange artifacts that seemed completely out of place in the ruins of a human city. And there, in the center of the room, embedded in a stone pedestal, was the sword of the Philosopher. The sword shimmered with an otherworldly light, its blade impossibly sharp, and its hilt covered in intricate alien markings. Arya approached it slowly, her breath catching in her throat. This was it, the weapon that could change everything. Her hand hovered over the hilt, and for a moment she hesitated. The sword was said to choose its wielder, and many had tried to claim it over the centuries, only to be struck down by its power. But Arya wasn't afraid. She had come too far to turn back now. With a deep breath, she wrapped her fingers around the hilt and pulled. The sword slid from the stone with a sound like a whisper, and the chamber filled with a brilliant golden light. Arya felt a surge of energy rush through her, filling her with a strength she had never known before. The weight of the sword in her hand felt right, as if it had been made for her. But the moment of triumph was short-lived. Alarms suddenly blared, and Arya's head snapped up. The crag, they must have detected the energy surge from the sword. She could hear the distant roar of engines as patrol ships neared her location. Her grip tightened around the sword. She couldn't let them take it from her, not after everything she had been through. She had to fight. With a determined look in her eyes, Arya turned and sprinted back toward the surface, the sword gleaming in her hand. She could hear the Krag ships landing above, their heavy boots thudding against the ground as they began their search. But Arya wasn't going to let them win. This time, she wasn't just running for survival. She was running for victory. Arya burst out of the underground stairwell, her boots crunching on the rubble as she sprinted through the ruins. The sky had darkened, and the once quiet city was now alive with the sound of Krag patrols. She could hear the hum of their ships hovering overhead, scanning the area for any signs of disturbance. The sword of the Philosopher pulsed in her hand, as if urging her to keep moving. She knew she didn't have much time. From behind her, the unmistakable sound of Krag soldiers shouting in their guttural language echoed through the streets. They had found the chamber, found the empty pedestal where the sword once rested. It wouldn't take them long to figure out who had taken it. Arya wasn't just an escaped prisoner anymore. She was the most wanted human in the galaxy. Ahead of her, a narrow alleyway between two collapsed buildings offered a brief escape. She darted into it, her heart pounding in her chest. The sword seemed to hum with energy, its strange symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. Arya didn't know how to use it yet, but she could feel its power coursing through her, giving her strength she hadn't realized she possessed. Suddenly, the ground shook as one of the Krag ships fired a warning shot, a blast of plasma hitting a nearby building and sending debris flying. Arya stumbled but kept running, her mind racing. She needed a plan, and fast. Fighting an entire Krag patrol head-on was suicide, even with the sword. But maybe, just maybe, she could outsmart them. Up ahead, she spotted a half-collapsed bridge that spanned a wide ravine. The structure was barely holding together, its steel beams twisted and rusted, but it was her only chance. If she could make it across, she might be able to lose them in the maze of wreckage on the other side. Arya didn't slow down. She leaped onto the bridge, the metal groaning under her weight as she raced across the unstable surface. Behind her, the Krag patrol was gaining ground. She could hear the thudding of their boots and the whine of their weapons powering up. They were getting closer, too close. As she neared the center of the bridge, a high-pitched voice crackled in her earpiece. It was Cal, the ship's eye. Arya, I've intercepted their communications. They've locked onto your position. You have approximately 2 minutes before they close in. Arya gritted her teeth. Thanks for the pep talk, Cal. Any chance you can get me out of here? Not unless you want to wait 20 minutes for extraction, which I assume is not an option. Not exactly. She skidded to a stop at the far end of the bridge. The way forward was blocked by a massive pile of debris, too high to climb and too solid to blast through without drawing more attention. She was trapped. The sound of the Krag approaching grew louder. They were almost at the bridge, their heavy footsteps echoing through the ruins. Arya's mind raced. If she didn't act now, they would surround her, and it would all be over. Her eyes darted to the sword, still glowing in her hand. There had to be something, anything, it could do to help. Without fully understanding why, she raised the sword, pointing it at the debris in front of her. A strange sensation flowed through her, as if the sword were reading her thoughts, responding to her will. The blade shimmered, and with a flick of her wrist, a blast of energy shot out, disintegrating the rubble in her path. Arya blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected that. "Not bad," she muttered, glancing at the sword. "Guess you've got some tricks after all." But there was no time to celebrate. The Crag were nearly on her, their guttural voices filled with fury. Arya ducked through the newly cleared path, her heart pounding. She could hear the hiss of plasma rifles firing behind her, but she didn't look back. All she could do was run. Cal's voice buzzed in her ear again. "There's a Krog blockade on the eastern side of the city. You'll need to head west to avoid them." "West," Arya groaned. "That's the long way around. Unless you want to end up as a trophy in their Hall of Victories, I'd suggest it." Arya adjusted her course, veering left as she sprinted through the ruins. The Krog were relentless, their patrol ships now scanning the streets from above. She could hear the ominous hum of their engines growing louder as they closed in. The sword pulsed in her grip, as if sensing the danger. Suddenly, a shadow fell over her, and Arya looked up to see a Krog ship descending directly overhead. There was no time to hide, no time to think. Her instincts kicked in, and she did the only thing she could. She jumped. The sword flared to life in her hand, its power propelling her higher than she thought possible. She soared through the air, landing with a roll on the rooftop of a crumbling building. The Krog ship fired, but she was already gone, sprinting across the rooftops with a speed she hadn't known she possessed. Below, the Krog patrols shouted in frustration. They hadn't expected this. Arya grinned despite the danger. She might be outnumbered, outgunned, and on the run, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Arya's breath came in short, sharp gasps as she crouched behind a broken wall, peeking through a crack to assess her situation. The Krag ships were relentless, their engines screaming through the sky as they hunted her down. Their searchlights swept over the rubble-strewn streets, and the guttural commands of the Krag soldiers echoed through the ruins. She had bought herself some time with her rooftop dash, but they were closing in fast. Her heart raced as she clutched the sword of the Philosopher tightly in her hand, its pulsing light a reminder of the raw power she had barely begun to understand. The sword had saved her twice now, first by disintegrating the rubble, then by giving her the strength to leap over the Krog ship. But it wasn't enough. She needed more. She needed to control it. The problem was, she had no idea how. Arya glanced around the corner, calculating her next move. She was deep in enemy territory with no allies in sight, and the Krog weren't going to stop until they had her in chains, or worse. She had to figure out the sword's true power before it was too late. The voice of Cal crackled in her earpiece again. "Arya, they're deploying more troops. You'll be overrun if you stay put." "No kidding," she whispered, her voice tight with frustration. "Any bright ideas on how to unlock a mystical sword's full potential in the next 5 minutes?" Cal was silent for a moment before replying. "The sword is ancient, its origins likely tied to the psychic energy fields that the Krog fear. It's not a weapon meant for brute force. You need to connect with it." "Connect with it?" Arya rolled her eyes. "You sound like one of those old meditation instructors back on Earth." "I'm not wrong. You've already seen its response to your thoughts. You need to focus, Arya. The sword is attuned to your mind. You just have to let it guide you." She didn't have time for this. The Krag were getting closer, but there was no other choice. Arya closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to block out the chaos around her. The distant roar of engines, the heavy footsteps of the soldiers, the flickering lights of the ruined city. All she could focus on was the sword, its warmth pulsing through her hand like a heartbeat. She concentrated, trying to feel its energy, to understand it. The sword's power felt wild, ancient, like a storm raging just beneath the surface. It was as if it were waiting, waiting for her to take control. But how? Suddenly, her mind was flooded with images, flashes of ancient battles, warriors wielding the sword against enemies she couldn't recognize. The scenes moved too quickly for her to fully comprehend, but she could feel the intensity of the warriors' will, their unshakable determination. The sword responded to their focus, bending to their commands, as though it were an extension of their very souls. Arya opened her eyes, her pulse quickening. Was that it? Was the key to mastering the sword not strength, but focus? A loud crash shook her from her thoughts. One of the Krag soldiers had fired a plasma shot that obliterated the wall she was hiding behind. Dust and debris filled the air as the ground shook beneath her feet. Arya barely had time to roll out of the way as another blast struck, sending a cloud of rubble into the sky. "Cal, I could use that extraction now," Arya shouted, scrambling to her feet. "I'm working on it," Cal replied. "I've hijacked a Krag transport ship, but it's going to take me a few minutes to reach your location." A few minutes was more time than she had. The Krag soldiers were closing in, their weapons humming with deadly energy. Arya gripped the sword tighter, her mind racing. She needed to act, and fast. Summoning every ounce of focus she had, Arya took a deep breath and closed her eyes again, pushing out the panic threatening to overtake her. She felt the sword's energy once more, and this time, instead of forcing it, she let it flow through her. The power surged, and she felt a connection, a bond between her and the weapon. Her eyes snapped open, glowing faintly with the same light that radiated from the sword. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she could feel the sword responding to her now, like it had become a part of her. The Krag soldiers rounded the corner, their hulking forms silhouetted against the dim light of their patrol ships. They spotted her and raised their weapons, but Arya was already moving. With a fluid motion, she swung the sword, and a wave of energy erupted from its blade, sweeping across the street like a tidal wave. The Krag soldiers barely had time to react before the energy slammed into them, sending them flying backward. Their weapons clattered to the ground as they were thrown against the ruins, stunned and disoriented. Arya didn't stop to think. She pressed forward, the sword blazing in her hand as she slashed through the air. Every swing sent arcs of energy ripping through the debris, clearing her path. Cal's voice cut through the chaos. "Arya, I've got the transport. I'm coming in hot." Arya sprinted toward the extraction point, the sword's power surging with every step. She could feel it now, fully attuned to her. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a part of her, a tool shaped by her will. And for the first time, she felt like she had control. The Krag were regrouping, their forces converging on her position, but it didn't matter. Arya raised the sword high and swung it in a wide arc. A shockwave of energy burst from the blade, sending the remaining Krag soldiers sprawling as she made her final dash for the extraction point. Ahead of her, the stolen Krag transport ship descended, its rear hatch opening as Cal guided it toward the ground. Arya didn't hesitate. She leaped into the air, the sword propelling her forward, and landed inside the ship just as the hatch closed behind her. "Nice of you to show up," she said breathlessly, collapsing onto the floor. Cal's voice crackled through the speakers. "You're welcome." As the ship lifted off, leaving the ruins of the city behind, Arya glanced down at the sword in her hand. The battle was over for now, but she knew the real challenge was just beginning. The Krag wouldn't stop until they had the sword back, and she still had no idea what its true purpose was. But one thing was clear. She was no longer just a runaway with a stolen artifact. She was something more. And the galaxy was about to find out exactly what that meant. As the Krag ship flew higher, Arya watched the cityscape below shrink into a distant blur. The stolen transport was barely holding together, rattling with every gust of wind. Cal piloted through the sky, dodging Krag patrols as best he could. "Where are we headed?" Arya asked, gripping the sword, her adrenaline still pumping from the fight. "The last human outpost," Cal replied, glancing at her through the cockpit's rear mirror. "The Krag don't know about it, yet." but they're close. Aria's mind raced. The Krag were relentless, and her newfound connection with the sword had barely scratched the surface of its potential. But one thing was clear. The Krag wouldn't rest until they reclaimed it. "How long do we have?" she asked, her voice steady. "Maybe a few hours. Their mothership is scanning the surface for us, and we've only got so much time before they find the outpost." Cal hesitated, then added, "You're not thinking about fighting them all off, are you?" Aria stared at the glowing blade in her hand. She had no choice. "I need to protect this sword, Cal. If the Krag get it, humanity's finished. I can feel it." Cal sighed. "There's another option. There's an ancient legend that says the sword can awaken something that even the Krag fear." Aria frowned. "What are you talking about?" Cal's voice dropped. "A weapon. An energy force hidden deep beneath the planet's surface. The Krag have searched for it for centuries, but only the sword can unlock it." "So, you're saying the sword is the key to activating this force?" Aria asked, her pulse quickening. "Exactly. And if we can get to the source before the Krag do, we might have a chance to turn the tide of this war." Aria thought about it. She had no idea how to fully wield the sword, but she knew one thing. The Krag would stop at nothing to get it back. And if there was a chance, however slim, that she could awaken this ancient power, she had to take it. "All right," she said, her voice firm. "Let's do it." Cal didn't argue. "We'll reach the outpost in 30 minutes. But be ready, Aria. This is going to be a fight like nothing you've ever seen." The outpost was hidden beneath a mountain range, shielded by layers of rock and artificial cloaking technology. When they landed, a group of ragtag human soldiers greeted them, their faces weary but determined. Aria noticed their surprised looks when they saw her carrying the sword. "Is that the sword of the Philosopher?" one of them asked, eyes wide. "Yeah," Aria replied, gripping it tightly. "And the Krag are coming for it." The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, but their leader, a hardened woman with a scar running down her cheek, stepped forward. "If what you say is true, then we don't have much time. We'll do what we can to hold them off, but this outpost isn't built for a full-scale attack." Aria nodded. "I'm not here to stay. We need to reach the source, the weapon hidden underground." The leader raised an eyebrow. "You mean the ancient power the Krag have been searching for? That's just a myth." "It's real," Cal interjected. "And the sword is the key. We need to move fast." Reluctantly, the leader agreed. She sent a small group of soldiers to guide Aria and Cal to the hidden chamber deep beneath the outpost. They moved quickly, descending through dark tunnels and caverns until they reached a massive door covered in intricate carvings, symbols that matched those on the sword. "This is it," Cal said, stepping forward. Aria stared at the door, her heart pounding. She raised the sword, its glow intensifying as she approached. The symbols on the door pulsed in response, and with a soft hum, the door began to slide open. Beyond it lay a vast chamber, its walls lined with ancient machinery, glowing faintly with power. At the center of the room was a pedestal, and above it hovered a sphere of light, crackling with raw energy. Aria took a deep breath and stepped forward, the sword vibrating in her hand. She could feel the energy calling to her, pulling her toward the pedestal. Slowly, she raised the sword and placed it into the slot at the base of the sphere. The room shook. Energy surged through the walls, and the sphere flared with blinding light. Aria staggered back, shielding her eyes. But the power didn't stop. It flowed through the sword, through her, connecting her to something vast and ancient. Suddenly, she understood. This wasn't just a weapon. It was a force, an ancient living energy that had been waiting for millennia. And now, it was awake. Above the surface, the Krag mothership descended, its engines roaring as it prepared to unleash its full might on the human outpost. Thousands of Krag soldiers lined up in formation, their weapons ready, their eyes fixed on the mountain range. Inside the ship, The Krog commander sneered. "The sword will be ours," he growled. "Prepare for the final assault." But just as the Krog forces began their march, the ground beneath them rumbled. A low, ominous hum filled the air, and the sky darkened as the ancient energy from beneath the surface surged upward, breaking through the rock and earth like a tidal wave. The Krog soldiers froze, their eyes wide with fear. They had heard stories of this power, tales passed down through their ancestors of a force so ancient and powerful that even their empire had never dared to confront it. And now, it was rising. Arya stood at the entrance to the chamber, the sword glowing brightly in her hand. She could feel the power coursing through her veins, binding her to the energy of the planet itself. The Krag didn't stand a chance. With a single thought, she unleashed the power. A beam of light shot from the ground, cutting through the sky and striking the Krag mothership. The ship trembled, its hull cracking as the energy tore through its systems. Krag soldiers scrambled to retreat, but it was too late. The mothership exploded in a brilliant flash, its remains raining down in fiery pieces. The battle was over before it even began. As the dust settled, Arya stood in the silence of the chamber, the sword still glowing faintly in her hand. The ancient energy had returned to its resting place, its purpose fulfilled. For now. Cal approached her, his expression one of awe and relief. "You did it," he said softly. "You really did it." Arya looked down at the sword, feeling its weight in her hand. "I didn't do it alone," she said, her voice quiet but filled with strength. The Krag might have been defeated, but she knew this was only the beginning. The galaxy was full of challenges, full of dangers, but now she was ready. And with the sword of the Philosopher at her side, she would face whatever came next.